In the shadowed folds of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, where the mist clings to the pines like a shroud and the wind whispers secrets through the hollows, there lay a forgotten stretch of land known as Goins Ridge. It was the kind of place folks in Wise County spoke of in hushed tones over flickering lantern light, a ridge so steep and unforgiving that even the hardiest travelers skirted its edges. Back in the summer of 1912, when the air hung heavy with the scent of wild honeysuckle and distant thunder rumbled like an omen, Sheriff Thomas Compton found himself drawn to that cursed spot. He'd been chasing ghosts, disappearances that stretched back over a decade, men who vanished into the wilderness without a trace. A surveyor here, a preacher there, a salesman whose horse wandered riderless into town. The locals blamed bears or bootleggers, but Compton, with his weathered face and unyielding gaze, sensed something darker, something that festered like a wound beneath the earth's skin. The Goins family had claimed that ridge since before the Civil War, but after old Samuel Goins met his end in a mining cave-in back in '78, his widow Eliza and her 3 boys, Caleb, Josiah, and Benjamin, had turned inward, building walls of silence around their ramshackle cabin. Neighbors recalled how the sons, once lanky boys with shy smiles, grew into brooding giants who patrolled the paths with rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes hollow as if they'd stared too long into some abyssal truth. Eliza herself was a spectral figure, rarely seen, her voice carrying faintly on the breeze as she recited scripture to the empty woods. Compton's deputies joked about the mountain hermits, but the sheriff felt a chill whenever he thought of them, a prickling at the back of his neck like the gaze of unseen eyes. It started with a hat, a simple brown bowler, mud-streaked and out of place on Benjamin Goins' head as he bartered for supplies in town. The mail carrier, Thomas Brennan, recognized it as belonging to Edmund Pierce, the slick-talking salesman who'd bragged about heading up the ridge just days before. That night, as Compton gathered his men under a moonless sky, the ridge seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. The path twisted like a serpent, roots snagging at their boots, and the silence was broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl that sounded too much like a warning. When they crested the hill and the cabin came into view, its windows dark, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, Compton's hand tightened on his revolver. Little did he know that what waited inside wasn't just blood and bone, but a secret so profane it would unravel the very fabric of what men thought possible in God's green earth, a tangle of faith and flesh that had bound mother and sons in a knot no blade could sever. The autumn of 1878 arrived early in the high hollows of Wise County, Virginia, bringing with it a wind that tasted of coal dust and coming winter. On the 23rd of October, just after dawn, the mountain took Samuel Goins. He had kissed Eliza goodbye at the cabin door the way he always did, quick, rough, the kiss of a man who believed work and silence were the only proper languages between husband and wife, then shouldered his pick and lantern and descended into the narrow vein the locals called Devil's Throat. The mine was a bootleg drift, barely shored with poplar timbers, worked by half a dozen men too poor or too stubborn to wait for the big companies. Samuel was both. At 38 he still carried the frame of the blacksmith he had once been, broad across the shoulders, arms corded from years of swinging a hammer before the war turned him into a soldier and the soldier turned him into a miner. He hummed hymns while he worked, the same 3 bars of Amazing Grace over and over, until the other men begged him to stop. The collapse came without warning. One moment the mountain breathed around them, cool and damp, the next it roared. A slab of slate the size of a boxcar sheared loose and crushed Samuel Goins where he stood, folding him like a letter shoved into an envelope too small. The sound, the men later said, was not loud, only final, the way a door slams in an empty house. They dug for 12 hours by lantern light, prying rock with bare hands until their fingernails split, but all they brought up were pieces, a boot still laced, the brass buckle of a belt, a fragment of jawbone with 3 teeth intact. The mountain kept the rest. Word reached the ridge just before dusk. Eliza was on her knees in the yard, scrubbing blood out of Caleb's shirt. He had cut his hand splitting kindling, when the neighbor's boy came running, hatless, face the color of tallow. He blurted the news and then stood there, shifting from foot to foot, waiting for the scream that never came. Eliza only rose slowly, water and blood dripping from her raw fingers, and stared toward the gap in the trees where the mine road disappeared. The wind lifted the loose strands of her hair and pressed her calico dress against her body as though the mountain itself were trying to hold her upright. Caleb, 12 years old and already taller than most men, stepped forward and took the scrubbing board from her hands. Josiah and Benjamin, 10 and 8, flanked her like silent sentries. None of them cried. Not then. The mountain had taught them early that tears were a luxury the high country did not allow. That night she sat on the porch long after the boys were asleep, the coal oil lamp unlit, rocking in Samuel's chair while the darkness pressed close. Somewhere below, an owl called once and fell silent. Eliza felt the ridge breathing around her, ancient and indifferent, and for the first time she understood that the world beyond its slopes was wider, crueler, and hungrier than she had ever imagined. She was 29 years old, alone with 3 fatherless sons, and the mountain had just claimed its due. In the hollow of her chest something shifted, the first faint fracture in the wall that would, over the coming years, widen into an abyss. The winter that followed Samuel's burial was the hardest Eliza had ever known. Snow sealed the ridge like a lid on a coffin, and the wind found every crack in the cabin walls to howl through. The boys grew lean and quiet, their eyes too old for their faces. Food ran low, the root cellar echoed when she tapped the barrels. At night she lay awake listening to the pop and creak of the frozen timbers, feeling the mountain press down, patient and immense, as if it meant to squeeze the last warmth out of her bones. One night in late February the temperature dropped so low the water in the bucket turned to a solid block before morning. Eliza woke long before dawn, her breath hanging in silver clouds. The fire had gone out. She rose, wrapped herself in Samuel's old coat, and carried the family Bible to the table. The book was heavy, its leather cover cracked, the pages soft as cloth from years of handling. She lit a single tallow candle and opened it at random, the way her mother had taught her when answers were needed. Her finger fell on Genesis 19, the destruction of Sodom. She read by the trembling flame, lips moving silently, the words familiar yet suddenly sharp, edged with new meaning. She read on, past Lot and his daughters in the cave, past the command to be fruitful, past every passage that spoke of blood and seed and covenant. The candle guttered. Outside, the wind scraped the roof like claws. Then it came. Not a voice exactly, more like a pressure behind her eyes, a certainty that flooded her chest the way warm whiskey floods an empty stomach. Images flared unbidden, the world beyond the ridge rotting under sin, towns full of painted women and liquor-soaked men, preachers who lied for coin, children born sickly because their parents had mingled with strangers. She saw her own boys grown tall and strong, saw them leaving the ridge one by one, saw their blood thinned and spoiled by outsiders until nothing pure remained of Samuel's line. The vision tightened around her heart like a fist. She understood then that the mountain had not taken Samuel as punishment. It had taken him as warning. The ridge was a sanctuary, set apart, and she had been chosen to guard what was holy within it. The candle burned lower. Wax pooled and hardened on the table like frozen tears. Eliza closed the Bible but did not move. In the stillness she felt the presence linger, patient, approving, ancient as the stone beneath the cabin floor. The fracture that had begun the night Samuel died widened further, splitting clean through every ordinary prohibition she had ever been taught. When the first pale blade of dawn finally slid between the logs, she was still sitting there, eyes wide and dry, already rehearsing the words she would use when spring returned and the boys were old enough to understand their true inheritance. Spring came late to Goins Ridge in 1891, a sullen, reluctant thaw that left the ground black and sour. Caleb was 25 now, broad as an oak door, his beard thick and red like his father's had been. He moved through the chores with the same grim silence he had worn since childhood, chopping wood until the axe handle blistered his palms, hauling water from the spring until his shoulders burned, always watching the tree line as though the world beyond might creep closer while he blinked. Eliza waited until the dogwoods bloomed white along the creek, the petals drifting like scraps of paper someone had tried to burn. She called Caleb into the cabin at dusk, the air still sharp enough to bite the lungs. The younger boys were sent to check the hog pen, a task that would keep them gone until full dark. Inside, the fire crackled low. Eliza had laid out her wedding dress across the table, the same yellowed cotton she had worn the day Samuel claimed her, now washed and mended so many times it felt thin as a communion veil. She did not waste words. She spoke of the vision that had sustained her through 13 hungry winters, of the voice that had grown clearer each year, of the ridge itself as an ark against a second flood, only this time the flood was corruption, not water. Caleb stood with his back to the hearth, the firelight carving deep hollows beneath his eyes. When she told him what the Lord required, he did not flinch, only stared at the floorboards as though he could see straight through them to the buried infants already waiting below. Eliza took his hand, calloused and trembling, and placed it over her heart. She spoke softly, the way a mother soothes a child waking from nightmare, reminding him that outside these mountains men lay with whores and begat idiots and cripples, that every stranger carried the taint of Cain. Here, she said, they could remain clean. Here they could obey. The ceremony was brief and wordless. She led him to the loft where the three boys had slept since they were small, the same ticking mattress that still smelled faintly of Samuel's sweat. Moonlight slid through the chinks in the logs, striping their bodies like prison bars. Caleb's breath came ragged, half terror, half surrender, but he did not pull away when she drew him down. The boards creaked beneath their weight, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed the pulse of the mountain itself. 9 months later, in the dead of night, Eliza bore a son so small he fit in a showbox. His skin was translucent, blue veins threading beneath like roots seeking water. He drew 3 shuddering breaths and was still. They wrapped him in a flour sack and carried him to the smokehouse before dawn, laying him beside the others in the cold earth. Another pale seed returned to the ridge that had demanded purity at any price. The years after Caleb's first surrender folded into one another like pages in a book no one dared open twice. Josiah turned 23 in the spring of 1894, lean and restless, with eyes the pale gray of winter sky. He had watched his older brother change overnight, Caleb's gaze growing inward, his mouth set in a permanent line, the way he flinched whenever Eliza brushed past him in the narrow cabin. Josiah knew what waited, had known since the night he crept back early from the hog pen and heard the loft creak above him like a gallows swaying. Eliza summoned him on a night when heat lightning flickered without thunder, the air thick and electric. She wore the same wedding dress, now patched again at the hem where mice had gnawed it during storage. She spoke the same words, softer this time, as though the mountain itself had taught her how to coax rather than command. Josiah listened with his fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white as river stones. When she finished he said nothing, only nodded once, the way a condemned man nods when the hood is lowered. Benjamin followed 2 years later, barely 19, still carrying the last softness of boyhood in his cheeks. He cried the entire time, Eliza explained, silent tears that cut clean tracks through the soot on his face. He begged to be allowed to leave the ridge, just once, to see the railroad they said now ran through Norton, to taste something besides cornbread and sorrow. Eliza cupped his wet face in her hands and told him the world beyond would eat him alive, that only here was he safe, only here was he loved the way God intended. Benjamin's sobs quieted to hiccups, then to nothing. He let her lead him upstairs the way a sleepwalker follows a lantern. Each union produced its fragile harvest. Josiah's child, a girl, lived 4 days, her cry thin as a kitten's mule. They found her cold one morning, curled against Eliza's breast like a broken bird. Benjamin's came in the winter of 1898, during a storm that buried the ridge under 3 feet of snow. The infant was born with a caul over its face, the membrane glistening like wet silk. Eliza peeled it away carefully, whispering that this one would live, this one would be strong. It gasped twice and died in her palms. They carried them all to the smokehouse floorboards, pried up with the same crowbar Samuel had once used to open crates of nails. The earth beneath was black and rich, fed by decades of hams and side meat, now fed by something else. Eliza marked no names, only pressed a small wooden cross into the dirt above each mound before the boards were nailed down again. The ridge kept its silence, the wind moving through the pines like breath through teeth, and the cabin settled a fraction lower on its stone piers, as though the mountain was slowly, patiently, drawing the family down into itself. By the turn of the century the Goins place had become a blank spot on every map men carried in their heads. Travelers who asked the way in Wise or Norton were met with shrugs and lowered eyes. Those who pressed were told the ridge road was washed out, or that bears had grown bold, or simply that no one went up there anymore. The truth was simpler and uglier. The 3 brothers had made it their business to be feared. Caleb took the high trails, moving like a wraith along the laurel hells where the ground dropped away into nothing. He carried Samuel's old Spencer carbine, its octagon barrel wrapped with copper wire to keep the stock from splitting, and he used it without hesitation the few times a hunter or moonshiner strayed too close. The bodies were dragged deep into sinks where the rhododendron grew thick as hedges, left for the hogs that ran wild and the crows that never lacked for meals. Josiah worked the lower slopes. He was quieter than Caleb, almost gentle in ordinary hours, but when he stepped onto the trace that led to the cabin his face changed, the bones seeming to sharpen under the skin. He strung fishing line between trees at ankle height, hung tin cans filled with pebbles that rattled like snake tails in the wind, laid deadfalls of locust logs balanced on triggers made from hickory withes. Children in the valley began to speak of the Goins boys the way earlier generations had spoken of witches, half warning, half dare. Benjamin, youngest and least willing, was given the easiest duty and the cruelest. He walked into town once a month for coffee, salt, and cartridges. He wore a slouch hat pulled low and kept his eyes on the ground, but people still crossed the street when they saw him coming. His hands shook when he counted out coins, and the storekeeper noticed the way his gaze darted to every doorway as though expecting judgment to fall like an axe. Once, a drunk from Pound tried to buy him a drink and clap him on the shoulder. Benjamin jerked away so violently he knocked over a barrel of nails, then fled without his change. Back on the ridge, the brothers rarely spoke of what they did. They simply did it, the way other men milked cows or sharpened plows. At night they sat on opposite sides of the hearth, staring into the flames while Eliza rocked and hummed the minor key hymns of her childhood. The cabin grew smaller each year, the walls leaning inward as if the mountain were hugging them tighter. Outside, the perimeter thickened, rusted scythe blades nailed to tree trunks at eye level, a half-buried wagon wheel rigged to roll down the steepest pitch if its trip rope was cut, a circle of salt and scripture pages hammered into bark with coffin nails. The wind carried the smell of pine and gun oil and something sweeter underneath, the faint, cloying rot that never quite left the air no matter how hard the rain scrubbed the hills. Martin Hayes arrived on the ridge in the last week of September 1898, riding a swaybacked mule and leading a packhorse loaded with brass instruments that glinted like fool's gold in the thin mountain light. He was 31, city-educated, with a soft Virginia accent worn smooth by years in Washington offices. The Geological Survey had sent him to map the coal seams that threaded the high ridges, and he carried letters of introduction signed by men whose names still opened doors in Richmond. He wore spectacles and a trim beard and believed that politeness, a good compass, and a government badge could take a man anywhere. He made camp the first night beside a branch that ran clear over slate, spreading his blankets under a stand of hemlock and writing in his journal by the light of a spirit lamp. The entries were precise, almost cheerful: elevation, strike and dip of the strata, the sweetness of the water, the way the stars looked close enough to touch. He never heard the three figures who watched from the laurel above him, motionless as stones. On the second day he pushed higher, following a faint trace that switchbacked through chestnut oaks. The mule balked at a wallow of mud and Hayes dismounted, tugging the lead rope while humming a hymn his mother had loved. That was when Caleb stepped from the shadows, rifle leveled, the bore steady as a preacher's finger. Hayes raised both hands slowly, smiling the way a man smiles at a nervous dog, and began to explain who he was, what he was doing, how the government only wanted to understand the mountain, not take it. Josiah and Benjamin came up behind him then, silent, moving in the way of boys who had learned to hunt ginseng and copperheads before they could read. Hayes never had time to turn. The rifle but caught him just above the ear with a sound like a green stick breaking. He dropped without a cry, spectacles spinning into the leaves. They carried him back at dusk, one brother under each arm, the third leading the animals. Eliza waited on the porch, the lamplight behind her turning her into a black paper silhouette. She did not ask questions, she only nodded once, the way a farmer nods when the harvest is finally in. They took Hayes to the smokehouse, laid him on the salting table still warm from the day's sun, and did what needed doing with knives kept sharp for hogs. Afterward Eliza read from Leviticus over the pieces, her voice steady, almost tender, while the blood ran between the floorboards and fed the earth that already held so many of her failures. They kept the mule, it was a good animal, and the instruments, which they buried beneath the corncrib because the brass might bring money someday. The journal they burned page by page, watching the neat lines of ink curl and blacken, the mountain swallowing another secret without a sound, thus a 450-word expansion of Key Point 7, the escalating disappearances after Martin Hayes, written in the same immersive, dread-laden style as the previous pieces. The ridge learned quickly how easy it was to make a man vanish. After haze, the mountain seemed to open its veins a little wider each season, as though tasting the air for the next trespasser. In the spring of 1901 came Jacob Whitmore, a circuit preacher from Kentucky, riding a raw-boned mare and carrying saddlebags stuffed with Bibles and tracts. He had heard rumors of souls starving for the word on the high ridges and believed himself called. He never reached the next hollow. Josiah met him on the trace with a smile almost gentle, asked for a blessing, then put a .44 slug through the mare's forehead when the preacher dismounted to pray. They dragged Whitmore behind the barn while the horse was still kicking, and Eliza quoted Revelation about the blood of the saints while Caleb soared. They kept the mare's shoes, iron was dear, and nailed one of the preacher's own tracts above the cabin door as mockery or talisman, no one was ever sure which. Edmund Pierce, the salesman, came in the fall of 1904 with a wagon-load of patent medicines and a tongue slick as axle grease. He wore a brown bowler and smelled of bay rum and ambition. Benjamin watched him from the laurel for an hour, fascinated by the bright labels on the bottles, before Caleb stepped into the road and asked the time. Pierce never finished pulling out his pocket watch. They took the wagon apart board by board, sank the axle in the branch weighted with stones, and cached the elixir bottles in the loft. Eliza used the laudanum when her monthly pains grew fierce, claiming it was manna sent by Providence to ease the burden of the chosen. There were others. A timber cruiser in '07 whose brass cruiser compass still hangs on a nail inside the cabin, 2 boys hunting ginseng in '09 who were found weeks later by hounds, or rather pieces of them were, a deputy U.S. Marshal in 1911 who came looking for a still and left his badge pinned to a hemlock with a skinning knife. Each time the pattern held. One brother lured, one watched the trace, one waited with the shovel. The bodies went into ravines or sinks or, when time was short, straight into the smokehouse earth alongside the pale infants. Their belongings were stripped, sorted, hidden. A pocket knife here, a silver flask there, a wedding ring melted down for shot. The mountain took the flesh and gave nothing back. By 1912 the disappearances had grown bold enough that even the hardest men in Wise County spoke the name Goins with the same hush they once reserved for fever and war. Mothers pulled children inside when the wind shifted down from the ridge, carrying that faint, sweet rot smell that no amount of pine smoke could cover. The brothers moved through their days like clockwork, faces burned dark by sun, eyes pale and flat, speaking less with each passing year. At night Eliza rocked on the porch and read aloud from the blood-spattered Bible, her voice drifting over the treetops like a lullaby no child should ever hear. The summer of 1912 was dry, the kind of dry that cracked the clay and made the creek shrink to a silver thread. Thomas Brennan, the mail carrier from Norton, rode his route on a mule named Sal with the patience of a man who had delivered other people's secrets for 23 years. On the 27th of July he passed Benjamin Goins on the lower trace. Benjamin stood beside the spring buying a plug of store tobacco with coins that clinked too bright, and on his head sat a brown bowler hat gone pale with sweat stains. Brennan knew that hat the way he knew every face on his route. It had belonged to Edmund Pierce, the drummer who vanished 8 years earlier almost to the day. The brim was cracked in the exact place Pierce used to crease it with his thumb when he laughed. Brennan said nothing then, only touched his own hat brim and rode on. But memory is a stubborn thing in mountain country. That night he sat on his porch in Norton rolling a cigarette with shaking fingers and told his wife what he had seen. By morning the story had reached Sheriff Thomas Compton, a thick-set man with a limp from the Spanish War and a reputation for finishing what he started. Compton had been collecting fragments for years, a brass theodolite stem found in a creek, a preacher's collar button, a deputy marshal's star bent like a clover leaf. He kept them in a cigar box under his desk the way another man might keep fishing lures. The hat was the first thing that tied the ridge to a living witness. He swore in 6 deputies, borrowed rifles from the National Guard Armory in Big Stone Gap, and started up the mountain on the 1st of August under a sky the color of heated iron. They left the mules at the foot of the steepest pitch and climbed single file, sweat blackening their shirts. The trace narrowed to a deer path, then to nothing at all. Tin cans rattled overhead in warning, but the wind had died and the sound carried only a few yards. Caleb watched from a ledge 200 feet above, finger on the Spencer's trigger, but something in the sheriff's steady advance made him hold fire. Perhaps even he sensed the hourglass had run out. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, sagging like an old dog too tired to rise. Smoke leaked from the chimney, though the day was stifling. Compton's men fanned out without a word. One kicked in the door while another circled to the smokehouse. The first thing they smelled was the sweet, heavy reek of earth recently turned. The second thing was Eliza's voice drifting from inside, calm and conversational, as though she were welcoming company for Sunday supper. When the deputies pried up the smokehouse floorboards with their rifle butts, the mountain finally gave up its dead, layers of bones small and large, infants tangled with grown men, some still wearing scraps of clothing, all pressed together like leaves in a book no one had meant to read. They brought Eliza down the mountain in a wagon because she refused to walk, sitting straight-backed among the chains as if riding to church. The jail in Wise smelled of lye soap and old blood, but she never wrinkled her nose. They put her in the women's cell, a narrow cage with one high window that let in a blade of moonlight, and there she waited 3 days without sleep, rocking on the cot's edge, murmuring verses only she could hear. On the 4th night Sheriff Compton came alone, carrying a single lantern and a straight-back chair. He set the chair outside the bars, sat heavily, and waited. Eliza watched him with the patience of stone. When he finally spoke, asking her name, the boys' names, anything to begin, she smiled the small, private smile of a woman who has already won an argument no one else knows is happening. Then she began to talk. Her voice was soft, almost tender, the mountain accent thick as sorghum. She spoke of the night Samuel died, of the voice that came afterward, clear as spring water running over slate. She told how the Lord had shown her the world rotting outward from the cities, how every marriage outside the ridge poured poison into the blood, how only the purest vessel could carry the seed forward. She described the weddings in the loft, moonlight striping the sheets, her sons trembling yet obedient, the way a shepherd's flock trembles before the shearer yet still lies down. She counted the infants one by one, naming the signs each had carried, the call, the 6th finger, the heart that beat outside the chest, proof, she said, that the Lord was refining them through fire. When Compton asked about the men buried beneath the smokehouse, her eyes grew brighter. Those were the thieves at the gate, the spies of a corrupt generation, the ones who would have dragged her boys down into the filth. Their blood had watered the covenant, just as Abel's blood cried from the ground. She quoted scripture in a steady stream, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, Revelation, twisting each passage until it fit the shape of her need like a blade sliding into a custom sheath. She never raised her voice, never faltered. Even when tears came, they rolled slow and perfect, as though rehearsed. The sheriff, a church-going man who had buried 2 children of his own, felt the walls tilt. He had come for confession, for remorse, for anything human. Instead he sat in the flickering lantern light while a woman barely 5 feet tall explained, calmly and with absolute certainty, how love and murder were the same act when performed in obedience to a jealous God. When she finished, the cell was colder than before, and Compton's hands shook so badly he could not strike a match. Somewhere in the corridor a drunk sobbed himself to sleep, but inside the cage Eliza Goins only smiled again, serene as winter moonlight on snow, already far beyond the reach of any law written by men. October turned cold early that year, the way it does when the mountains decide punishment is overdue. Benjamin lasted only 6 days in the Wise County Jail. He hanged himself with the chain that tethered his ankle to the wall, using the same knot he once tied to keep hogs from rooting under the fence. They found him at dawn, knees bent, face purple, tongue protruding like a dark fruit. The coroner wrote fear of the rope on the certificate, but everyone knew it was Eliza's eyes he could no longer bear, even across the corridor. Caleb and Josiah faced the circuit court together in November. The courtroom in Wise overflowed with people who had never met the brothers yet hated them with the clean, righteous fury reserved for things that crawl out from under rocks. The evidence was laid out on a pine table: buttons, pocket watches, a brass theodolite, a child's skull no bigger than a man's fist. The prosecutor read from Eliza's confession until his voice cracked. The brothers sat motionless, heads bowed, red hair cropped short by the jail barber. When the jury returned in 23 minutes with 2 verdicts of guilty, neither man looked up. They hanged them on the first Friday in December, side by side on a scaffold built from fresh-cut oak. A preacher offered last rites. Caleb spat in his face. Josiah only stared at the sky as if waiting for the voice that had guided them all these years to finally speak again. The trap fell at 10 minutes past 9. Their necks snapped clean. The crowd dispersed slowly, quieter than anyone expected, as though the mountain itself had leaned over the proceedings and drawn the sound out of their throats. Eliza never stood trial. 3 doctors from Richmond examined her for a week and declared her mind gone beyond salvage. They committed her to the Western State Hospital in Staunton, a red brick fortress where the screams echoed down corridors that smelled of carbolic and despair. She arrived in wrist irons, hair shorn for lice, still wearing the same faded calico dress she had worn on the ridge. The attendants expected raving, but she was gentle, almost childlike, rocking in her cell and humming the same minor key hymn she had hummed over graves. When visitors asked if she repented, she only smiled and said the boys were waiting for her on the ridge, pure at last. The county burned the cabin the following spring. Flames took the roof first, then the walls, then the smokehouse, until nothing remained but blackened stones and the faint outline of foundations. People said the fire burned hotter than pine and oak had any right to burn, as though something older than wood fed it from below. Even after the ashes cooled, dogs refused to cross the ground, and for years afterward hunters swore the wind still carried a woman's voice reciting scripture to the empty air.